Welcome to tonight's lecture, which is the annual lecture of the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context, which is also supported by the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. It's a pleasure for me to be back in Queen Mary. It's a particular pleasure to be introducing Professor Jennifer Pitts, who's Professor of Political Science in the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago. She's been at Chicago in other roles since 2007. Prior to that, she worked at the University of Princeton, and before that was assistant professor at Yale. She completed her doctoral research at Harvard and her BA at Yale. So Jennifer's, I should say Professor Pitts, I'm just so used to speaking.
Please call me Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer or Professor Pitts. Her work has imaginatively and importantly spanned the areas of intellectual history and political theory, very much focusing on the topics, the themes of empire and international relations. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Professor Pitts and one or two other figures in the field have really created this field as a vibrant area of intellectual debate in the humanities. Well, there's much to say about her work, so I'm in fact going to confine myself to two major studies. I'd say a little bit about them very briefly before handing over to her, because it's obviously her you want to hear this evening. First of all, her first award-winning book, which is Return to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2005, which is focuses on the 18th and 19th centuries, a rather panoramic overview of both centuries, taking in such figures as Burke, Smith, Bentham, Condorcet, Constant, Tocqueville. The book really charts a shift in sensibility, in politics, in ideology, spanning the transition from the 18th to the 19th centuries, in which essentially the complicity between empire and liberalism is examined. I think we would all agree that it is certainly a field-defining work. It defined a field. The second main work that I want to mention is the recently appeared, splendidly produced, Harvard University Press 2018, Boundaries of the International Law and Empire. Well, this recent study concerns the relations between the law of nations and differential international hegemonies spanning the globe. It argues that the law of nations is not simply an extension of egalitarian ideals outwards from a European centre, but was an ideal compromised from the outset by the realities of European empire and domination. I'd like to quote a line about the book from a recent review from another major historian, Samuel Moyne, a review that appeared in Political Theory. It says, so I'm giving you this one line, which I think says a lot, "It is clearly the finest book ever written on the topic." Well, it is an enviably compact and elegant study with I have to say, breathtaking range. Its focus is again 18th and 19th century, but Victoria, Grotius, other major 17th century figures make an appearance. But focusing then on Vattel, Montesquieu, Burke, Wheaton, Ward, Scott, and other very well-known and lesser-known figures who've contributed to the relevant debate. It encompasses commentary and study of law, history, political philosophy, and altogether represents an acute challenge to parochial universalism, Professor Pitts' phrase, that has afflicted and continues to afflict international relations. Well, it's genuinely, I think, a privilege to have Professor Pitts with us this evening, a scholar whose achievements are matched only by her modesty, most unusually. And her title for this evening is The Society of Nations, Imperialism and the Colour Line, Three Conceptions of the International. So I'll hand over to Jennifer. She'll speak for between 50 minutes and an hour, and we'll then have time for questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, for the incredibly generous introduction. Thank you to Max Delmar for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you all for coming. I know there's a vote hanging in the balance right now, so I appreciate your being here rather than somewhere else awaiting its decision. So as Richard said, my work has been on the history of political thought in the 18th and 19th century. In this talk, I'm venturing into the 20th with a certain amount of trepidation, but not very far into the 20th, so we'll see. So 100 years ago this month, when the Peace Conference opened its meetings in Paris to devise the League of Nations and found the post-war global order, European and American lawyers and statesmen understood the international system as, in Woodrow Wilson's words, a society of free nations. At the Peace Conference's opening ceremony on January 18th, 1919 at the Quai d'Orsay, Wilson said, "In a sense, this is the supreme conference in the history of mankind, for more nations are represented here than were ever represented in such a conference before, and the fortunes of the entire world are involved." Imperial governance was a major preoccupation for such figures, but in their conceptual architecture and their legal formulations, international society, by which they understood the society of quote-unquote civilized nations, could be detached from imperial considerations. In my talk this evening, I want to consider three contrasting visions of the international system, and to think about these in relation to the fact that the major states of that system since the late 18th century had been global empires. I'll focus on the moment around 1919 when these conceptions crystallized and confronted one another in an especially striking way, but I want to suggest that they remain significant for our own thinking about the contemporary global order. James Tully has argued that the world legal and political order is best characterized as an imperial order of some kind, but that our dominant languages of disclosure and research conceal and overlook the imperialism of the present. I want to take up Tully's notion of languages of disclosure to discuss the history of this problem with the failures or occlusions that have long been dominant in international law, understood broadly as a set of conceptual and discursive resources we draw on to analyze the political world. So just briefly to summarize the three visions I'll be discussing, the first is the picture of the international realm as a community of free and equal nation states. The conception was famously articulated in Aimé de Vattel's 1758 treatise on the droit des gens, or law of nations. It remained powerful through the 19th century, and it continued to do significant work in the 20th, at the end of the First World War and in the framing of the League of Nations in 1919, and then again in early conceptions of the UN at the meetings held in 1944 at Dumbarton Oaks and 1945 in San Francisco. The conception is dramatized in this map of League members as individual nation states with their imperial holdings and mandates marked separately with the cross hatching over Africa. The same conception is mobilized for anti-colonial purposes in this map, printed in the journal Young India in 1919, and marking the oppressed nations yet to be liberated and to join the League of Nations. And the map encapsulates the aspirations of those that Erez Manella has described as the global Wilsonian moment, and he uses this map in his book. So that's the first vision. The second is the vision of the international articulated in J.A. Hobson's socialist critique of imperialism, part of which made its way into the League of Nations by way of Jan Smuts. Hobson, though he saw capitalist imperialism as the major cause of war in the modern world, and thought Europe's economic relations with colonies in the tropics had consistently showed, in his words, commerce at its worst, still developed a vision of the international community as restricted largely to European states, who he thought would collectively exercise supervision over those he understood as backward peoples. In this, he was typical of British socialists. Third, I'll turn to the conception developed by W.E.B. Du Bois that, I will argue, more adequately captured the imperial realities of the 19th and 20th century world order, and that remains indispensable for thinking about the world today. Du Bois, too, was in Paris in early 1919, having convened the first Pan-African Congress with the aim of petitioning the Peace Conference, whose participants largely, and to their lasting detriment, ignored Du Bois and his arguments. In Du Bois's picture, the international realm was a racial, imperial, and capitalist hierarchy in which European states' obsession with imperial power and profit was at once a rivalry that lay at the root of both world wars, and at the same time a collaborative domination by Europeans and their white descendants over the rest of the globe, those Du Bois called the darker races. I'll dwell longest on Du Bois's account, as he articulated it in one of the most brilliant essays of his career, the 1915 essay, The African Roots of War, and then developed it during and after the First World War, and then again around the Second. The image of the international community as a society of free and equal nations dealing with one another on terms of mutuality and reciprocity encapsulates a profound and compelling normative vision. Such nations are understood as respecting one another's autonomy, but also bound to offer assistance when others are in need. But throughout its modern history, this conception has tended to obscure imperial domination and has often been used to justify it. This postcard, produced for the Portuguese dictatorship of António Salazar in 1934, lays bare the conceptual divorce between the community of European nations and their empires by overlaying the territory of Portugal's African empire over a map of European nation states in order to insist on Portugal's status as a world power. And as you can see, Portugal is not a small country here, and this was produced in many languages and produced as postcards to be handed out to tourists in Portugal. One of the virtues of Du Bois's account is that it is attentive to deep structures. It shared that with Marxist and other leftist accounts. But any adequate structural diagnosis of capitalist exploitation must also deal with racial ideology. And this is something that Hobson and his fellow European socialists, including, I think, Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, were mostly not willing or equipped to incorporate into their understanding of the global order. Du Bois's international thought, I want to suggest, poses a challenge for the normative aspirations of international law, that they not obscure forms of domination, but rather cast critical light on them. So the notion that the international system is a society of equal nations has deep roots in European thought. Vattel's 1758 treatise on the law of nations, arguably the single most influential work of political thought through the early decades of the 19th century, played a key role in articulating this picture. In Vattel's hands, the image of the international community as a society of free, legally equal, sovereign nation states, and he used the terms nation and state interchangeably, was an appealing and enormously influential conception. The Vattellian model of sovereignty retains its power in part for the same reasons that made his book so influential when it was first published: its ability to steer a course between what Martí Koskaniemi has called apology and utopia. Vattel's theory hews close enough to actual state practice, that's the apology side, to seem like a useful schema of the real world. And at the same time, it presents a normative vision we can use to evaluate and criticize that world, one of an always elusive balance between the moral values of autonomy and interconnection. But it's precisely the conception's ambiguous position between apology and utopia that's proven deeply problematic. It is, as is commonly the case in international law, an aspiration couched as a description. As an aspiration, it encapsulates a commitment to the political autonomy of diverse communities that's remained a central pillar of modern international politics in the form of the principle of self-determination. Nations for Vattel are moral persons because they're the site of a shared moral project for all their citizens. As moral persons, they can be understood as having a conscience, and it's to that conscience that the law of nations appeals. Nations owe it to one another not to intervene in their internal affairs because that would interfere with the autonomous pursuit of their collective moral project. Vattel's community of nations is also in principle universal, though this universalism sits uncomfortably alongside an overwhelming focus in his text on the practices and principles of what by his time was coming to be called the European state system. And here's the European state system. Europe divided into its great states. This is a map around the time of the 7 Years' War when Vattel's text was published. And again, it's a vision of Europe divorced from the global empires that these European states were acquiring at precisely this time. Combined with Vattel's stated universalism, the aspiration to a community of equal nations had considerable critical potential. Partly because of this critical purchase, Vattel was translated and invoked by political actors outside Europe in opposition to European commercial and imperial expansion in the early 19th century. So I'll just give you one example, which is Hamdan Hoxha, an Algerian writer who had key passages of Vattel translated into Arabic in the course of his struggles in the 1830s against the French conquest of Algiers. He drew on Vattel and the Vattellian image of equal nations in the hope of persuading what he called true Frenchmen to recognize Algeria's right to take its place as an equal in the community of nations. And I won't read the passage, but he's essentially saying Europeans are looking to Poland and Belgium as they're supporting the independent nationality of these states. Why do they deny it to the Algerians? For all its critical potential as an aspiration, however, when taken as a shorthand description of the actually existing international order, this Vattellian conception obscured imperial politics. It rendered opaque the fact that major European states were global empires, rather than, as they appear in Vattel's text, simply national communities of citizens engaged in a shared and implicitly republican political project. Having constructed an image of the international order in this light, Vattel himself largely disregarded the violence of European commercial and imperial expansion. And this, I think, was in striking contrast to many of his French and British contemporaries, Voltaire or Diderot, say, Adam Smith or Edmund Burke. And it may be not incidental that Vattel was Swiss and involved in continental European politics rather than an inhabitant of a global empire. Moreover, as his text gained stature throughout Europe, and especially in Britain, as the preeminent work on the law of nations in the last decades of the 18th century and the early 19th, Vattel's picture of the international was made to do important ideological work on behalf of imperial politics. British and American polemicists constructed a narrative in which European states were part of an international community of non-imperial nations who were interested only in free and fair commerce and relations of mutuality, in contrast to despotic Asian states that were said to be imperial by nature and incapable of reciprocity, incapable only of dominating others. Capable of only dominating others. So it was argued, for instance, by British and American advocates of the first Opium War, such as John Quincy Adams, the former US president, then a representative, that European states had the right and even the duty to bring those empires coercively and in a subordinate position into an international legal order of nation states that was historically European but prospectively universal. In this way, the conceptual structure of international law worked paradoxically both to hide legal hierarchies, even as it was also used to justify them. The blindness of Vattel's theory to imperial exploitation was, in a sense, weaponized by 19th century imperialists. The Society of Free Nations, whose contours Woodrow Wilson outlined in his 14-point speech of January 8, 1918, bears all the hallmarks of the Battalion schema. The day of conquest and aggrandizement is gone by, Wilson announced. What we demand in this war is that the world be made safe for every peace-loving nation, note the term nation there, which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealings by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are, in effect, partners in this interest, and for our own part, we see very clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. Wilson took up the question of the colonized world in point 5 of the 14 points, calling for absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, by which he meant balancing the interests of colonial populations against what he called the equitable claims of the colonial powers, a formulation that, for all the universalism of the language in the passage that I just quoted, excluded colonized peoples from those free nations that made up the community bound by international law. And just to stress the language here, colonized peoples passively had interests that could be represented by others. Only the colonial powers were in the positions of agents and makers of claims. And not incidentally, Wilson reserved the term imperialism for German aggression. So I'll just briefly note a few points of continuity between Wilsonian internationalism, as it's encapsulated in the 14 points, and the Battalion scheme, especially as it was deployed for imperial purposes in the 19th century. So first, the way that empires other than Germany and the Ottoman Empire appear as peace-loving nations rather than empires. Second, that Europe is made to stand in for the world, as when Wilson writes that the wrong Germany did to France in Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 has, in Wilson's words, unsettled the peace of the world for nearly 50 years. Third, the insistence that freedom of trade is a core value of the international community. And fourth, the suggestion that for those aspiring to enter the international community, acceptance of the rules dictated by a small group of the world's most powerful states is itself a condition of being recognized by those states as a worthy member. As Gary Simpson has argued, both the League of Nations and the United Nations instituted legalized hegemony by granting extraordinary legal prerogatives to the major powers, and yet talked constantly about the Society of Free and Equal Nations. And I'll just note in passing that there are similarities with the 1941 Atlantic Charter drafted by Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, both in the expression of principles and in the quiet exclusions, and in the confusion or misunderstanding around the world of the degree to which the principles might be mobilized for anti-colonial purposes. The criticism that Wilsonian self-determination was an exclusive and Eurocentric vision is surely warranted and important. The criticism, that is, that Wilson never actually intended to apply the principles of the 14 points to the colonial subjects of the Allies' empires, and that's a criticism that's been made by many. But I want to suggest an additional and perhaps deeper concern with the conceptual architecture of the community of nations and its relation to modern imperialism, a problem that became apparent in the 1919 debates. Wilson's 14 points may be read as suggesting a non-imperial nation-state model that the world could finally universalize with decolonization. In doing so, he followed the standard histories told from the mid-19th century onward, in which international law arose among European nations, equal European nations, was a diplomatic system worked out by them in isolation from the rest of the world, after which they could gradually set about extending it to the world. But that so-called nation-state system actually emerged within and was always materially dependent on a system of global capitalist and imperial exploitation for which the conception had no space. Du Bois was, I'll suggest in a few moments, the thinker who saw this most clearly during and immediately after the First World War, or at least one of those who articulated it most powerfully. A world that overcame the racialized capitalist exploitation that Du Bois observed could then not be constructed on the model of the European nation-state. You couldn't simply universalize the nation-state. So to turn to the second picture of the International I want to discuss briefly before turning to Du Bois, this comes from J.A. Hobson's socialist critique of imperialism. The great innovation of positivist and socialist thought on empire from the 1870s onward, in the thought of figures from Richard Congreve through Edward Bernstein to the Fabians, as Gregory Claeys and others have shown, was the development of a theory and critique of capitalist exploitation as the underlying cause of imperial expansion. Hobson developed this theory in the wake of the Boer War with his Psychology of Jingoism of 1901 and his 1902 book, Imperialism, A Study, which in turn was the major influence on Lenin's 1915 Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In Hobson's account, the advanced capitalist economies of Britain and the United States suffered from a massive failure of distribution, which caused a crisis of underconsumption among the working class and the overaccumulation of wealth in the hands of capitalists, who then had to find somewhere to put all this wealth and insatiably pursued foreign markets for investment, drawing in the military to support their risky ventures. Imperialism was driven by capitalists and financiers, but it was made national policy through the acquiescence of the people, who embraced the delusion that imperialist policies benefited them as well. The masses were dupes of the financiers and the educated classes, who sold them imperial wars by way of modern advertising, precisely as they sold mustard and matches. And you can see Hobson here. So many persons are convinced that there was a Boer conspiracy and can even tell you what it was and what it aimed at, in the same manner as they are convinced that Coleman's is the best mustard and Bryan and May's the best matches. These persons get their convictions honestly, though these convictions can hardly be termed intellectual. Hobson didn't see the prosperity of the West as a whole, only that of the capitalist classes, as parasitic on the exploitation of the colonized world. Hobson powerfully exposed the emptiness and hypocrisy of the myth of the civilizing mission that had saturated British imperial rhetoric through much of the 19th century. He saw no evidence from actual British conduct anywhere in the empire throughout the prior century to suggest that civilizing its subjects or preparing them for self-government was among the empire's purposes, and he's cutting and ironic and powerful on that point. And yet largely missing from Hobson's account was an understanding of a hierarchical global order and the role of ideas of civilizational and racial superiority in sustaining it, although glimmers of that come through, as we'll see. His was a leftism, as was so often the case, hobbled by its developmental discourse. Rosa Luxemburg was another to fall prey to this way of thinking. This meant that with other of the more critical strands of British thought on the empire, Hobson held out the hope that, duly reformed, rule by Europeans over non-Europeans was not only inevitable, but also desirable. Given his clear-eyed critique of British liberal imperialism, it's striking how sanguine Hobson was that multilateralizing imperial control would solve the problem of exploitation. He's so severe on the British and yet so hopeful that multilateral arrangements will solve the problem. Hobson's disregard for racial ideology as a feature of the global structure is evident in remarks he made at the Universal Races Conference held in London in 1911. At a session on interracial economics, at which both he and Du Bois spoke, Hobson said that he had had difficulty writing a paper about the topic of interracial economics because these economic contexts, he said, were not primarily interracial at all. They were the contexts of individuals of different nations and countries. They were international. Race, however, entered as a qualifying factor in respect of different capacities of labor. That is, as he clarified in the rest of his remarks, race was relevant not as a part of the global structure, but rather as a feature of the character and culture of different peoples with respect to their work habits. He stressed the globalization and mobility of capital, but only in order to insist on its homogenizing effects. He acknowledged that some interracial problems would arise from what he called the unscrupulous methods of profit seekers, but he called these minor eddies in the more general flow of the global economic order toward homogenization. Du Bois, in the same session, sought to put the discussion of race on a more structural footing by insisting that the problems of black workers with suppressed wages in the US and of an asymmetrical, as Du Bois put it, intercourse between backward and forward nations were aspects of the same racialized global economy. I'll just say a very brief word here about Lenin, whose account of the international order I won't be addressing in the talk. Lenin was preoccupied especially with the novelty of late-stage monopoly capitalism in the work that drew on Hobson. So the history he told was a discontinuous one in which the real imperialism begins after the supposed free trade stage of capitalism. Real imperialism begins with finance capital and monopolies. Du Bois had a much more continuous and I think more compelling story about racialized exploitation as central to the modern global order, indeed the early modern and the modern global order, across the particular transformations of capitalist production. So a story in which slavery gave way to a trade in raw materials and then to the exploitation of nominally free black labor. Hobson consistently endorsed what he saw as a peaceful internationalism, which he presented as the antithesis of imperialism. And this was an argument that he made from the opening pages of the book Imperialism through to his 1915 Towards International Government, which was an important influence on Jan Smuts's initial formulation of the League of Nations mandate system, which Smuts published as a pamphlet, The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion. Oops, sorry, I don't have the slide for that, in December 1918. Hobson's argument was that nationalism is a plain highway to internationalism. Imperialism, in contrast, what he called earth hunger and scramble for markets, was a perversion of nationalism into chauvinism and the impudent negation of international morality, as he put it. So Hobson proposed in Towards International Government to replace imperial rivalry with an embryonic world government. As he put it, a federal government of European nations and their colonial offspring, composed, as you see here, of civilized and powerful states. His arguments for European trusteeship over the colonized world are typical of the early 20th century European and radical socialist visions of the global order, with multilateral arrangements in which the West as a whole, generally under the guise of the international community, exercised tutelage over backwards peoples, both for the sake of their own development and, crucially, in ostensible stewardship of the natural resources in their territories that they were supposedly not yet in a position to exploit efficiently. And here again, developmentalism is the key to the limits of Hobson's analysis. Hobson's very concerned about the efficient exploitation of natural resources. Like Wilson and other liberals, Hobson took the European system and the international community to be essentially synonymous, and he often spoke of it as a diplomatic system of nations that, again, could be conceived in isolation from their imperial holdings. You have the system of the Society of Nations in Europe, and then the question of imperial management is kind of a separate one. So just to sum up, Hobson recognized the pathologies of European societies as the major cause of violence and injustice in the modern world. He was not unaware of the danger that a more collaborative and less competitive European political structure would nonetheless continue to exploit the non-white world, as the passage on the slide suggests. He asked, could the white nations of the earth thus banded together be entrusted with the fate of their colored fellow beings? And he left it as an open question, but he hoped that they could. But he refused to imagine the international community as extending much beyond Europe for the foreseeable future, and he conceived of no political role for the colonized. They were merely, like the territory on which they resided, objects of European administration. For all Hobson's acute analysis of capitalist imperial exploitation, then, he adopted enough of the imperial framing of the international lawyers of his day to make his thought perfectly suited to Smuts's purpose of using the League and its mandate system to maintain imperial control over the non-white world. So now turning to the third image, Du Bois and the global color line. While for Hobson imperialism was a perversion of true internationalism, for Du Bois empire was constitutive of the international order. In May 1915, the same summer that Hobson published Towards International Government, Du Bois offered what is tempting to read as a searing rejoinder to Hobson's long-standing hopes for a benevolent multilateral imperialism, or supervision, which Du Bois had encountered in person in Hobson's remarks at the Universal Racist Congress. In The African Roots of the War, published in May 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly, Du Bois traced the causes of the First World War to imperial exploitation and the ideology of white supremacy that underwrote it. In doing so, he demonstrated how the dynamics of war that other analysts saw as internal to Europe and as shocking, unprecedented, and almost inexplicable were, on the contrary, the predictable outcome of European imperialism. Unlike those whose anti-colonial nationalism, as Manella has argued, was galvanized at least at first, or at least briefly, by Wilson's 14 points, Du Bois was never under the impression that Wilson provided a good model for the decolonization of the world. He believed that Wilson showed no understanding of Europe nor European politics, and that Wilson's failure to understand Europe was due directly to his failure to understand the worldwide problems of race. Du Bois might more pointedly have said was due to Wilson's own racism. He was already a bitter critic of the domestic politics of race, of a president who, after all, was a fan of the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. In November 1918, so shortly before the peace conference, Du Bois had written a letter to Wilson urging him, though surely with a sense of the futility of the plea, to consider the situation of Black Americans as a matter of international concern at the peace conference. And this is from the draft of that letter. So he says in the letter that the situation of Black Americans should be considered a question of international interest as much as any. Wilson didn't reply to the letter. Du Bois also showed that the standard responses to the war by pacifists and internationalists such as Hobson were wholly inadequate to the problems they thought they were addressing. He noted the presence of Smuts, whom he called the great protagonist of the white race, at the founding of the League of Nations and later at that of the UN, as malign and ominous. We who want peace, he wrote, must remove the real causes of war, namely the combined rivalry and collusion of European imperial exploitation. It was a warning he voiced to the participants of the Paris Peace Conference and then again to the framers of the UN in 1945. The third picture of the international I want to discuss then is Du Bois's account of international society as a racial hierarchy, one he developed with particular intensity during both world wars, when he insisted that the standard European understandings of the international were epistemically or analytically flawed in ways that left political actors ill-equipped to reform the system to prevent catastrophic global conflict. Du Bois had, of course, famously announced at the original Pan-African Conference held in London in 1900 that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. And he insisted from his first uses of the phrase that the problem of the color line had to be understood, in his words, not simply as a national and personal question, but rather in its larger world aspect in time and space. So he always understood the problem of the color line as global. Yet his treatment of race in the global order changed in a subtle but I think striking way from his initial analyses at the turn of the century to his view later catalyzed by the First World War. In one of his earliest uses of the phrase, in his address of December 1899 to the American Negro Academy, titled The Present Outlook for the Dark Races of Mankind, Du Bois announced that the color line belts the world and that the social problem of the 20th century is to be the relation of the civilized world to the dark races of mankind. But his analysis in that speech was a fairly conventional comparative survey of different empires and their treatment of their subjects. He offered something close to praise for Britain's relative success in dealing with undeveloped races, as he put it. And he noted that the Congo Free State, in the Congo Free State, trade and industry had developed, the railway had crept further into the heart of Africa, and the slave trade has at least been checked, in his terms. His accounts of the non-European states were likewise conventional. He spoke of the still lively corpse of Turkey, the still wild deserts of Arabia and dreary Persia, and of the marvelous internal decay that overcomes China. Similarly, in his speech at the 1911 Universal Races Congress, a speech likely attended by Hobson, Du Bois focused not on a global political and economic structure driven by racialized imperialism, but rather on racism as a pervasive sentiment in various contexts around the world. So it was a sort of snapshot of many different contexts of racism. Although, as I noted earlier, Du Bois did nudge the conversation about interracial economic relations in a more structural direction, the framing of the Universal Races Conference was not likely to elicit the analysis that Du Bois would offer a few years later in his wartime articles for a few reasons. First, the emphasis at the conference was on harmony among the races, or what was called interracial friendliness, and you see the Occident and the Orient shaking hands here. Second, there was a considerable focus on the effort to debunk the scientific status of race, and less emphasis on the construction of blackness in the service of exploitation. As we saw in Hobson's participation, people like Hobson seem to have been blind to the very possibility of that kind of structural role of race. And third, the meeting included a strong emphasis on the part of white participants representing law and economics, including Hobson, on the reality of backwardness and the need for a greater sense of responsibility by the civilized toward the backward. Du Bois, ever attentive to the limitations of his audience, seems to have tailored his contribution accordingly. So when and why did Du Bois adopt the more structural understanding of the global system as one of racialized imperial exploitation? There are hints of it in earlier writings, as in his 1904 credo, warning prophetically that imperial violence is self-defeating. But it was with the onset of the war that Du Bois developed the view into a full-fledged theory of the global order. He later recalled stopping in at the Hotel Astor to hear Andrew Carnegie talk to his Peace Society, so early in the First World War. War had begun between Italy and Turkey, but, said Mr. Carnegie blandly, we're not talking about peace among unimportant people. We are talking about peace among the great states of the world. I walked out, Du Bois recalled. Here I knew lay tragedy, and the events proved it, for the great states went to war in jealousy over the ownership of the little people. Europeans were inclined to think of the First World War as a watershed, both in the violence it unleashed and the aspirations for peace and international cooperation that its horrors animated. But Du Bois argued that the seemingly exceptional violence of the war had in fact ample precedent across the colonial world. Here's a list Du Bois later compiled of the constant colonial warfare of the 19th century that laid the groundwork for the world wars. I know it's very small, you won't be able to see the details, but just the sense that there war after war after war in the 19th century, a century that was often seen widely as largely peaceful by European analysts. So as long as the competition for colonial exploitation and the culture and ideology of white supremacy that enabled it remained unchecked, Du Bois thought, the European civilization that dominated the globe would persist on its devastating as well as its ultimately self-destructive course. The First World War was, he said, a jealous and avaricious struggle for the largest share in exploiting the darker races. He wrote this in Of the Culture of White Folk, the 1917 essay that elaborated the arguments of the African roots of war. Is then this the end of war, he asked. That's the second half of this passage on the slide. Can it be the end so long as its prime cause, the despising and robbery of darker peoples, sits enthroned even in the souls of those who cry peace? Note that as Robert Vitalis has shown in White World Order, Black Power Politics, the Journal of Race Development in which this essay was published was the flagship journal of the discipline of international relations, which eventually became, as it remains, the Journal of Foreign Affairs. What Du Bois made clear in his essays published during the First World War was the material dependence of European democracy and the European international community on a global system of imperial domination, on the exploitation of racialized imperial subjects. This is a conception that my colleague Adam Getachew, in her brilliant book, World Making After Empire, just out in the next few weeks, has discussed as a critique of international hierarchy as a form of slavery, which she traces through a great number of thinkers of the Black Atlantic from the 19-teens through the 1970s and the moment of the new international economic order. She argues that such an understanding led these figures, among whom Du Bois was an early voice, to reconceive self-determination as requiring not simply nation-state sovereignty, but rather a far more thoroughgoing restructuring of the global order. And they thought in terms of federalist projects, and again, the NIEO as a radical transformation of the economic order. But back to Du Bois. I just want to make a brief aside to register how thoroughgoing Du Bois's indictment of the Allied powers and the causes of the war was in 1915, which is important, I think, because he's often been criticized for his strenuous efforts to enlist African American soldiers in the war effort when the US entered the war in 1917. He was censured at the time. He later faulted himself, and he's been taken to task by more recent scholars. But it's important to see that the African Roots of War makes clear that he fought for African American inclusion in the war, not because he thought that the so-called democracies among the Allied powers were either virtuous or truly democratic nations, but rather with a profound awareness of their central place, more central even than Germany's, in the global system whose pathologies had produced the war. That he thought Germany's racism was deeper and its imperial and military policies more egregious, and in the immediate term more dangerous, made it, in his view, strategically sensible for African Americans to aid in the Allied war effort. But he endorsed this course without illusions. More puzzling, I think, is his later expression of regret for having done so. That regret can perhaps be attributed to the fact that even his extremely modest hopes that African American participation in the war might do something to erode racism in the US were utterly dashed by the extreme racism that Black troops faced from their white counterparts on the battlefield, and then again after their return to the US after the war. So I'll just summarize three of Du Bois's key arguments in these First World War essays. First, the modern democratic nation, the nation, not simply European elites, was now the agent of imperial exploitation. Second, international law facilitated capitalist exploitation of the extra-European world by marking the relationship between metropole and colony off limits from international scrutiny. And third, white supremacy had come to be so thoroughly part of the fabric of Western culture that it vitiated the understanding and the reform efforts of even the most progressive elements of white society, pacifists, socialists, and labor leaders. And I'll just develop each of these points a little bit further. So first, Du Bois argued that the democratic nation was now the agent and the beneficiary of imperial exploitation. He called this the new democratic despotism. And bear with me for some slightly long quotes. So as he wrote, it's no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. Whence comes this new wealth and on what does its accumulation depend? It comes primarily from the darker nations of the world. The sharing of imperial spoils eased social conflict within Europe. The poverty of the masses was somewhat mitigated through colonial profits and consumer goods on the one side, while for their part, the ruling captains of industry, as he put it, can be reconciled to any amount of democracy as long as they had continued impunity in the colonies. So colonial exploitation did a lot to ease social conflict. And there's a key difference here from Hobson's account of the role of European masses in the dynamics of imperialism. As we saw earlier, according to Hobson, the European masses didn't materially benefit from imperial profiteering. Imperialism was a perversion of the national political economy for the benefit of capitalists. National funds were taken to support the military, and the capitalists drew profit from the venture. For Du Bois, in contrast, because the European masses shared in the spoils of empire, the modern nation, and therefore also the international system, was constituted rather than perverted by imperialism. And the tremendous expense of post-war reconstruction, particularly in the nations devastated most by the war, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, would only intensify the impulse to exploit. In what sounds like a direct response to Hobson's theory of maldistribution, Du Bois wrote in the 1921 Manifesto to the League of Nations of the Second Pan-African Congress, "If we are coming to recognize that the great modern problem is to correct maladjustment in the distribution of wealth," which again was Hobson's great theme, "it must be remembered that the basic maladjustment is in the outrageously unjust distribution of world income between the dominant and suppressed peoples, in the rape of land and raw materials, and monopoly of technique and culture. And in this crime, white labor is particeps criminis with white capital." Despite the fact that the white working classes themselves suffered under imperial capitalism, white socialists and their labor supporters had failed to grasp fully the dynamics of global domination because they were also its beneficiaries. They'd been seduced into demanding a greater share of imperial profits, rather than recognizing that ultimately their own liberation depended on an end to the even more extreme exploitation of non-whites around the world. This was not, I think, just a pious hope on Du Bois's part, that ultimately the liberation of white labor depended on the liberation of black labor. The argument is a structural one rooted in the economic and political dynamics of imperial capitalism. The most direct connection was war. Imperial rivalry would continue to drag European nations into both endless violence outside Europe and the devastation within Europe, exemplified by the First World War. The connection also included the chronic suppression of wages for white labor. Second, Du Bois showed the ideology and the institutional structure of the international system, so that is international law, facilitated imperial exploitation by rendering it invisible or placing it outside the bounds of international concern. So the bifurcated social imaginary in which the international remained centered in Europe, as we saw in Wilson and again in Hobson, what I've been calling the battalion schema, made it standard to ignore or belittle colonial violence. As Du Bois wrote, "Behold little Belgium and her pitiable flight, but has the world forgotten Congo? What Belgium now suffers is not half nor even a tenth of what he has done to Black Congo since Stanley's great dream of 1880. More generally, he argued, capitalism requires exploitation, which, given even the most rudimentary impulses of liberal humanitarianism, in turn requires forms of secrecy that become unavailable within the so-called family of nations. Why, he asked, must entrance on world markets depend so largely on owning colonies and dominating weaker countries? Because one can do with one's own and in the darkness what cannot be done in open concert of nations with the flair of publicity and maudlin philanthropy." The bifurcated world picture also supported the illusory hope that reform within European societies could proceed independent of, Hobson, as we've seen, thought it would produce, the redress of global exploitation. So fix dynamics at home first and global exploitation will stop. That's the Hobson picture. So that's the second point about international law. And then third, Du Bois's explanatory lens of white supremacy allowed him to see that any picture of the international order that read Europe, or so-called civilized nations, as stand-ins for the international and stewards of the international order was bound to recreate imperial exploitation in a new guise. White supremacy was all but worldwide, he wrote in Of the Culture of White Folk. This white supremacist theory of human culture and its aims has worked itself through warp and woof of our daily thought with a thoroughness that few realize. Even the most radical European reformers' projects were compromised by white supremacy. We've already seen the limitations of Hobson's critique and his unfounded hopes, his seemingly unreasonable hopes in the terms of his own analysis, that a European federation would govern the world non-exploitatively. The various efforts towards peace, Du Bois wrote in 1915, show with singular unanimity either the utter inability or the determined refusal of the peace advocates to consider race prejudice as the prime cause of the present world war. He noted that the vision of the Socialist International was as racially skewed as the dominant picture in international law. In Germany and America, he wrote, international socialists had all but red, yellow, and black men out of the kingdom of industrial justice. Subtly had they been bribed, but effectively, were they not lordly whites, and should they not share in the spoils of rape? He would point out again in 1938 that English trade unions continue to be guilty, in his words, of inexcusable discrimination against their black fellows in Africa by virtue of their recognition of the racially discriminatory white South African labor unions and their refusal to support black labor movements in West and South Africa. As for the Russian Soviets, he added, they have appeared in Africa chiefly as deliberate troublemakers without waiting to study local conditions. The politics of solidarity among the quote-unquote darker races that Du Bois pursued in the 1920s reflected in part his pessimism about white labor movements' ability to see their interests as aligned with those of black laborers. Having summarized Du Bois's account of the global structure, I want to mention one further feature of his international thought of this period before I turn to my final theme, which is the relationship between aspirational normative visions of the international, empirical description, and critical purchase. There's a seeming mismatch between Du Bois's searing critique of the global order and what many commentators have noted were his very modest proposed solutions, which don't seem even remotely adequate to address his critique. The modesty of the proposals put forward by Du Bois in the Pan-African Congress to the League drafters in 1919, which included essentially international supervision over the German colonies and certain legal protections for Africans, suggest, I think, that Du Bois did not see the League of Nations, dominated by imperial powers in the thrall of the ideology of white supremacy, as he had amply shown in his wartime essays. He didn't see the League as a meaningful site of global transformation, in contrast to political solidarity and revolutionary action among what he called the darker races across the world. He dramatized this project in his 1928 novel, The Dark Princess, in which the Indian heroine Kautilya leads a global anti-imperialist and anti-racist movement that draws in the African-American hero, Matthew Towns. Kautilya is significantly named for the 4th century BCE Indian statesman and political advisor to whose work of political science and economic thought, the Arthashastra, various anti-colonial thinkers and lawyers were turning in the 20th century as an alternative non-Western source of principles of international law. So Du Bois, I want to suggest, was one of the first thinkers to understand, and remains among the most valuable for helping us to recognize, that any picture of the global order that doesn't place at its center both the legacies of imperialism and the ongoing reproduction of an asymmetrical and racialized structure is fatally flawed. By asymmetrical, it's important to stress inequalities of legal standing as well as political and economic power, as we've learned from now generations of argument by anti-colonial figures, again, many powerfully analyzed in Adam Getachews' book, by anti- and post-colonial lawyers, and more recently by TWAIL scholars of the Third World approaches to international law. At the same time, there are good reasons to hold on to Vattel's twin aspirations to political autonomy on the one hand and universal concern on the other. Vattel, like both Hobson and Du Bois, I would suggest, valuably saw the realization of political autonomy alongside concern for the welfare of all human beings as the normative ground and ultimate purpose of the rules of international conduct. I've mentioned the ways in which Vattel's normative account, when understood as a shorthand description of the world as it is, obscured the imperial nature of the global order. His principles of autonomy and universal concern have arguably had pernicious effects in the form in which they were articulated in the UN Charter as the principles of sovereignty and human rights. I've discussed these problems, which have been particularly apparent in impasses and debates over humanitarian intervention elsewhere, and I won't dwell on them here, but I'm happy to talk about them in the discussion. It's worth noting that Du Bois himself did sometimes have recourse to the image of a world of free and equal nations as an aspiration. In the 1921 Manifesto to the League of Nations, he offered the white world a choice: either fully assimilate African subjects into European empires as citizens with fully equal civil, political, and social rights, or accept the rise of an independent African state that would be, from its beginning, a part of the great society of peoples in which it takes its place with others as co-rulers of the world. Later, looking back from the vantage of 1945, he suggested that what I've called the battalion ideal had helpfully supported varieties of anti-imperial politics in the 19th century, which the First World War had finally destroyed. And bear with me for another long passage. So in fact, he says, the 19th century dream of the poets of a world filled with peaceful but independent nations, each pursuing its own variety of culture, supremely valuable in their very difference and nonconformity with set patterns, was a dream of real intellectual and political freedom. It had been illustrated in the settlement of Massachusetts and Maryland and even Oglethorpe's Georgia. It was proclaimed by Toussaint, Dessalines in Haiti. It was even planned in the Balkans and Far Asia. Then gradually it was overwhelmed and with a dying gasp in 1919 was beaten back by recurrent and mounting waves of imperialism, compelling the world to follow one increasing line of profitable industry, concentrated luxury, and power. The small free nation began to disappear from reality. The one great ideal was empire, and increasing empire. The one sure outcome was war. If now we are going to reestablish peace on earth and goodwill toward men, we must reestablish the right of small nations really to be free. And he's writing this, as you see, in 1945. Or publishing, at least. A lot of the passages published in Color and Democracy had been written earlier. In giving an account of Du Bois's conception of the international, I haven't attempted to give his thought any label. There are, of course, long-standing debates in the literature about Du Bois as to whether to understand him as a Marxist, a kind of liberal, a Pan-Africanist, a Nietzschean, and the list goes on. The political philosopher Charles Mills has recently argued that it makes sense to think of Du Bois as a black radical liberal, against the view that black radicalism has two variants, nationalism and Marxism, both of which are fundamentally opposed to liberalism. Instead, Mills argues, the most valuable elements of black nationalism and black Marxism can indeed be incorporated into a suitably revised liberalism, one whose social ontology has been reconceptualized to admit the centrality of racial and class domination to the making of the modern world. All this matters for my purposes not because it's important to affix a label to Du Bois's thought, but because, as I've been arguing this evening, Du Bois helps us to understand that one of the major failings of liberalism has been its tendency to confuse aspiration and description in ways that occlude systemic oppressions in liberal society, both domestic and international. And indeed, the very separation between the two, between domestic society on the one hand and international on the other, has contributed to obscuring the systemic nature of the problem of racialized exploitation. Susan Marx has argued that exploitation theory invites us to see that there are systemic logics at work. Just as liberalism's talk of free and equal citizens under the law disavowed capitalist exploitation, as Karl Marx showed on the Jewish question, the same, she notes, is true of international law. She goes on, the silence of international law's interlocutors about these systemic logics is their silence about capitalism. Susan Marx emphasizes a crucial feature of exploitation, one that was also a theme in the work of Iris Marion Young, that under global capitalism, not only do the beneficiaries of exploitation far outnumber its most direct perpetrators, and include most of us in the global north, but also the complexity of structures of production make it easy for its beneficiaries to remain in ignorance of that exploitation in all its details. The effects of exploitation are far away and relatively easy to ignore, and their impunity is experienced as innocence. Critical international legal scholarship has called attention to this exploitation, and Marx-inspired Twale scholars such as Upendra Bakshi and B.S. Chimney have focused attention on the distinctive nature of the exploitation of the third world that takes place under global capitalism and the complicity of international law in that phenomenon. Du Bois was a pioneer of this approach, one that does not give up altogether on the emancipatory potential of the legal institutions that it recognizes as both covering up and fostering that exploitation. The realization of something like the demands voiced on the Young India map, recall the map of what will happen to the oppressed nations of the world, did nothing to alter the basic asymmetry in the global order that Du Bois identified, and none to curtail the power of capital based in the global north. Du Bois's lifelong preoccupation with the intertwined nature of racial injustice in the US and in the international order allowed him to see something that many of the anti-colonial nationalists of Erez Manella's Wilsonian moment did not, that the United States was no anti-imperial beacon of freedom and democracy, but on the contrary, a society in which racial exploitation was part of its very fabric. Given the settler colonial nature of American society, as Aziz Rana has so powerfully shown, US ideals of freedom and equality have always been parasitic on inequality and injustice. This made the rise of the US to international preeminence in the 20th century ominous for those struggling against international hierarchy. And this is precisely what Du Bois was warning. The apparent impunity with which European states perpetrated imperial violence turned out to be illusory. The violence, as Du Bois said, came home to destroy Europe in the world wars. The ability of rich and powerful states, above all the US, to wreak havoc, military, economic, political, and environmental, in the global South has, if anything, only increased in the century since Du Bois's reflections. The contemporary international legal order continues to protect and to some extent to hide the effects of exploitation from its beneficiaries, under talk of sovereign equality, free trade, good governance, and the responsibility to protect. But that exploitation is likewise coming home to roost, most immediately in the dislocations of right-wing populism, and most ominously in global environmental destruction. The ideals of political autonomy and universal concern remain compelling ones, I've tried to insist, but accounts of the international order that are inscribed in law as ideals must be able to register their own violation in the world. They must be able to recognize structural asymmetry, systemic injustice, and the ability of the powerful to use law to enhance their power by naming it as legitimate. So they must be able to register their own violation in the world rather than obscuring it. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and the discussion. So you'll call on people and do my best to. Yes, please. That would be good. I'll just write them.
Amount of time for questions. So please collect your thoughts. We're ready to take them. Please.
I'm really struck by what I guess could be called a habit, or people might want to call it a methodology of yours, which is to integrate the text and the paratext and the way that texts get rewritten over time. So your analysis of Vattel and how his meanings get inverted in the context of, for instance, the opening movement and so on. And it struck me then, sort of inspired by that, to wonder about certain effacements in, first of all, in Du Bois. In Du Bois, so the Wilsonian turn to Latin America seems to be completely absent from his frame, where, rather like Samantha Power, Wilson was going to teach people how to elect, as he put it, teach them to elect good men and bomb them until they did that. So it seems odd that Du Bois seems to be effacing that, at least as presented here. And I'm wondering if you saw in his work any references to what Wilsonian democracy and internationalism and self-determination meant in the practice of gunboat diplomacy, for instance, or was he just blind to that?
So I'm not sure that I'm understanding the force of your question. I mean, it seems to me that the people that one might want to criticize are the anti-colonial nationalists who see Wilson as a potential liberator. What I was trying to say about Du Bois is that, having been primed in part by an experience of Wilson as an exponent of very retrograde racial politics in the U.S., Du Bois did not see Wilson as a bringer of democracy to the League. It's the anti-colonial nationalists who said things like, America is an anti-imperial country, so Wilson will help liberate us. I mean, so I haven't personally studied those figures. My knowledge of them is really through Erez Manella's book. And one thing he makes clear is how short-lived that moment was, that they quickly became disillusioned. It quickly became clear that Wilson had no intention whatsoever of pushing against British imperial designs, et cetera. But what I was trying to say about Du Bois is that he didn't even have a momentary illusion about that. About the specific point about Latin America, I don't recall whether he mentions it, but he was critical of Wilson throughout. So, am I responding to your question?
Somewhat. So if I could just push one more time. So the force, I think, is the way in which these effacements are nested. So
right,
instance,
okay.
I could ask a similar question about Hobson, right?
Okay.
He was not racialized, but he was, because for him, finance becomes anti-Semitic and
right.
taproot, right? Or I could ask a similar question about Smuts. He was forging a white unity politics across the Afrikaner and the English, and that fusion politics of the 30s in South Africa. So what I'm getting at is the way in which one of the vexing questions in your extremely invigorating global frame is how people's effacements create new blind spots.
I see.
So
And
that's
Latin America becomes a blind
it's
spot.
driving to.
I see. Yeah, it's a great question. I fear it may be an artifact of the limits of my time and knowledge, and so I would hesitate to place that on Du Bois without further research. I just don't know whether he addressed it.
So can I bring this back with one more point?
Yeah.
And just to return to my comment about your kind of methodology, for me it seems really well staged and almost enacted in the acknowledgements of each book. So in 2005, your
This is slightly alarming to be read so closely, but I'm fascinated by this. Yeah.
So in 2005, you're in your sort of car school. My reference to Samantha Power wasn't accidental. Her comments about Allende and how that was, her seemingly uncritical 2008 remark about the intervention, the U.S. intervention there, and so on, very Wilsonian. And it seems to me if you skip from the 2005 acknowledgement to your book now, there's the whole Koskanini thing, and it's a completely different school, and it's a wonderfully detailed kind of genealogy of where your book comes from and how you created this field. And so I have the same curiosity about what the acknowledgements to the book will look like.
I see.
Is another part of mine, and so that's just kind of, I wonder if there's a context. Is it Chicago against all expectation, or is it where does this? Because there's this one amazing quote from Du Bois about the
in the book, yeah.
In the book, but this seems to be pushing beyond that.
I mean, that's precisely what I was trying to do here. Is he makes a kind of cameo appearance in the book. I was incredibly struck by that essay of the souls of the culture of white folk of 1917. And didn't have time or space or whatever to deal with it in the book. And I thought, this is where I'm excited to go next. What is this? What's behind that perception at that moment when everybody else, when the basically white international lawyers of the time are saying, where did World War I come from? We were working toward, we had some doubts about civilization and militarism, but basically, the Hague conferences and all that were creeping toward to a new world order where there will be peace and will spread the European vision and all that. And Du Bois comes along with this incredibly powerful essay and says this is all complete nonsense, and these people have no idea what the world that they're looking at really is like. So the point of this, you've seen through me, I suppose, that the point of this talk was precisely to push that farther and see where it goes. As far as influences, I really have yet to engage properly in the vast Du Bois literatures. There's a racial capitalism literature, which is burgeoning, which again I'm need to get familiar with. So I appreciate the question and don't have.
By the way, I'm not seeing through you. I find it massively generative and kind of inspiring. So it's not.
Thank you for the question. I didn't mean, no, it's fine to have reasons to write new things, like I didn't get to do it in the book, but I really appreciate your comment about text and paratext. I never thought about that, but I'm going to borrow that. I need to know who you are so that I can attribute it to you. We can talk afterward.
There's another question next over here. Do you mind waiting for the microphone? We'll be with you in seconds.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two brief questions. One is in relation to the debates that continue around bilateral investment treaties.
Okay.
The legitimacy of that, given the background that you've just established. The second question is more specific to the dynamic between the U.S. and China.
Okay.
And Graham Allison's reference of the Thucydides trap. Do you think it's actually more a color line discussion?
Oh, really interesting. So on your first question exposes my vast and basically complete ignorance about contemporary international law. So as the previous question said, boundaries of the international came out of my engagement with a certain pocket of writing in the history of international law, and I became incredibly gripped by this line of argument and thought, among other things, that my field of political theory really needs to know about it, engage it, et cetera. We're talking about related phenomena, and yet the conversations, at least at the point when I had started writing the book, were not really happening. I mean, they're now happening in ways that are really exciting. But the result, this is a long preamble to say, I basically don't know anything about contemporary bilateral treaties and the debate about them, but I would love to hear your own answer to your question. If you would like to help guide me, I would be interested.
In short, there are several developing countries, emerging markets that are tearing up their treaties simply because they have found themselves at the mercy of investors and typically hedge funds that are exploiting these treaties for gain. And clearly, when you look back at the history of these treaties, they were very much drafted and imposed during the process of decolonization. So.
Right. I had thought when you seemed to be stressing bilateral, I thought maybe you were suggesting a contrast between bilateral treaties and multilateral arrangements. And I guess my instinct would have been to say that one should be as suspicious about the multilateral arrangements like the WTO as of the bilateral treaties. But one would have to do a much more detailed study. But yeah, I mean, again, all I know about that really comes from Anthony Engie and his, the way that he shows that in the process of decolonization, the sovereignty of decolonized states was not, as it was widely said to be, equal legal sovereignty. It was compromised in all kinds of ways so that states were not granted the prerogative to alter the terms of contracts by legislative fiat, which had been a standard prerogative of sovereignty and that kind of thing. So, but that's all in Engie. I don't know any of that firsthand. Oh, the second about U.S. and China. Is it racial? I mean, the talk about the fear of China sounds like the yellow peril. In that sense, I would say, yeah, there are certainly continuities there. And it sounds actually quite like, there was an earlier moment when there was a terror in the U.S. about the rise of Japan as an economic power, and then it shifted over to China. And in that sense, I think it is racialized, but I don't have a well worked out thought about how to think about that.
I've got a quick question myself, since it looks like
okay.
And then, I did feel myself wondering about the European losers. So the European one-time winners, France, Germany. What about the losers who don't fit into the colour line and therefore make the colour line look like an American projection and a flat Earth theory itself? Right.
Like Ireland? Or
well, I'm certainly not going to mention Ireland.
Yeah.
You would never think of Ireland.
Poland, but forget about Poland. The liberation of Russian serfs in the late 19th century, a serf's a slave. So the liberation of Russian slaves has happened very recently. They're not world historical winners, but they don't figure in this story.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking more in terms of the construction of states rather than peoples within them. And there's a way in which Russia, for all, in the 19th century debates about the civilized nations that comprise the community of international law, they say, well, we all assume that Russia's part of it because it's European, but then after all, one author says, why is China out and Russia's in? If you go to the hinterlands of China and the hinterlands of Russia, they're both equally uncivilized, and yet we assume Russia's in and China's out. So there's a way in which racialization is a social construction. So why does Russia get racialized as white or as in civilized, and the Ottomans don't? I mean, there's religion there. I think Ireland is always. I know you didn't mention it explicitly, but it is always a really fascinating case. And there, in U.S.
Austria-Hungary. I mean.
Austria-Hungary gets broken up as a result of the war, but it's not. It's not legally subjugated in precisely this way that we've just been talking about in terms of the kind of sovereignty. I mean, I think on the one hand, the picture of free and equal nation states, and this is in a sense Gary Simpson's argument about great powers and outlaw states, that on the one hand there's kind of free and equal nation states. On the other hand, there are hegemonic powers that inscribed their disproportionate power in legal institutions like the UN Security Council. So there's hierarchy within Europe. But there is also a sense, I think, within Europe that of a kind of equality. I mean, that back to the battalion line, that the point of statehood is essentially that a dwarf is as much of a man as a giant, as Vattel said. It doesn't matter if you're big or small, you have equal statehood. And the point of the global color line is that's just simply not true for those that are racialized as dark. And I think Ireland, when there's a book, how the Irish became white, or when the Irish became white. Sorry?
Sorry, not yet.
Nigel, yeah. So that's a really interesting particular case. But I think for the most part, even small and fairly vulnerable European states do get, incorporated in a certain sense into that framework of free and equal nations.
George. Thanks. Silly question, really, but as I unfortunately have read The African Roots of War, 1915, and the first argument that the nation is an agent of imperial exploitation, it reminded me immensely of Rabindranath Tagore's lectures on nationalism two years ago, later.
Later,
It may
okay.
just be that he had read Du Bois. It may just be that they had the same problem. They were facing the same problem, but the lectures in Japan and in America on nationalism, from our point of view, what he calls nationalism is what we would now call imperialism, basically. But that was the point. He was saying the nation, the organized nation, is a mechanism for exploitation of other people, which eases the conscience of people who would never do these things individually, but somehow, through the metaphysics of the nation, they allow themselves to do these horrible things to other people. So I was wondering if it's more general at the time of the First World War, if there are more people, to the extent that you can comment, or could it just be that he had read him?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if this project goes anywhere, that's where it will go, is to figure out who else was saying this kind of thing around this time and which of them may have been reading Du Bois or not. So I actually don't know. I recently ran across a reference to that Tagore work and thought I need to read it, but I haven't yet, so I don't know what he says. Another work by A. Philip Randolph and a co-author called, I think, the Darker Nations and the Peace, or something to that effect, also makes very similar arguments. Again, that's a few years after Du Bois. I would love to know, I mean, they were fairly close associates, so it wouldn't be at all surprising that they knew his argument. Was it, direct influence or not? I don't know, but that is exactly what I'd like to look into. So thank you. I will look into it and hope to have an answer at some point. Yeah, I don't know the connections. I mean, Lala Lajpat Rai is the main Indian nationalist contact that Du Bois had, as far as I'm aware. Another thing that I would like to pursue, actually, on that question has to do with that Dark Princess novel, and just the heroine's name, as I said. I don't know where he got the name, to what extent he was talking to people who thought Kautilya is, potentially the source of a non-Western international law. That Charles Henry Alexandrowicz, the Polish international lawyer, who's writing a number of decades later, wrote an essay on the Arthashastra that was precisely saying this is what, this is a kind of source of Indian international law. I assume he's getting that from a longer tradition of Indian thinking earlier in the century, and that's what I want to look into. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be done with it, and also scholarship that I'm not yet aware of about those connections. Yeah. Anyway.
Great. Fifth row in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, Jennifer. Just to follow on with this conversation, I think Nehru was in the UK around in the early 20th century, and he also participated in a lot of these international meetings, and he was also in contact with the one at the LSC, the socialist at the LSC. I can't his sorry? Yes, yeah, Lasky. Yeah.
Lasky, okay.
Yeah. So there are these links, and I was just wondering, because I've come across some of this in my research, where he talks about some of these meetings, but kind of in passing, is something that I wanted to look at as well. But I was just wondering if you'd come across any.
I mean, there's there's a lot of work on these there's the Universal Races Congress in 1911, and then there's all the stuff that happens around 1919, and I think the relationship between those two is quite interesting, and as I was sort of gesturing at the particular kind of motivations for and agenda for the Universal Races Congress were quite distinctive, and I think things changed a lot in the wake of the war. And so thinking about like sort of who was at that event and then again involved in the post-World War I discussions is an interesting thing to pursue, but there's a lot of literature and all this that I have to catch up on. So, yeah.
Will? So over the other side. You need two mics, really.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Talk. I guess I had one sort of smaller, like another event or moment to think about in the early 20th century, which is the war between Russia and Japan in 1905, and this sort of moment in which this non-European nation, Japan, is able to defeat Russia in war. And I've seen in the sort of time in which I've dabbled in the political thought of this period, references to this as a moment when, like, Graham Wallace, for instance, thinks, wow, like, we need to start rethinking everything we think about, the global international order. So I'm curious, maybe if you've come across any discussions prior to World War I, when sort of, but from that kind of, from that event that lead to, is there a rethinking of the international order even prior to World War I as a result of that moment?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the international lawyers, I mean, some kind of ingenuously and others cynically say things like, well, Japan has proved that they're white after all they beat Russia. All it takes is military power and suddenly you're white. And on the other hand, Japan then in the League debates, Japan is having been an ally achieves a certain status in the League debates, and they try to sponsor a racial equality article that gets shot down. So their incorporation into the the inner circle was clearly partial and didn't lead to a broader recognition. I mean, I think there was a lot of worry on the part of the British and others that a racial equality provision would open the door to, delegitimization of the British Empire, et cetera. So that didn't go very far. So yeah, I mean, I've tended to see what happens with the Russo-Japanese War as, in a sense, kind of from the perspective of what went before it with the quote-unquote standard of civilization, and the sense that there's a community of civilized nations and others get to enter it as they become fit, and Japan is deemed fit in the wake of that war. But partly what I'm trying to do here is show the way in which that very picture is deeply problematic because it presents the community in question as a community of nations and not empires. I mean, you could say it's precisely because Japan is a kind of quasi-imperial power trying to become an imperial power that they get in also. But the idea is that the standard of civilization is ostensibly a standard by which quote-unquote nations get to enter the community of nations, and what I've been kind of using Du Bois to say is it's not a society of nations at all. And yet that language is constantly used to both cover it up and justify it at the same time, which I said paradoxically. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that they can do that. You would think if it's being covered up, how can you invoke it for justification? But somehow they manage to do both at the same time. I don't think Vattel, to go back to the initial image, I don't think Vattel had nefariously imperialist impulses himself. I think it was more a blindness. I'm not sure it matters, really. I mean, to get inside Vattel's head. But I do think it was, that's why I use the term weaponized in the 19th century. I do think the conception is weaponized, and it plays out in the moment that you're describing, kind of in a pattern.
Two over, one, yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, it's fascinating. At the risk of pushing you kind of outside of the area you're talking about, I wanted to ask you a bit about how this might tie into some contemporary debates. Not really necessarily about the contemporary world, but in particular I'm thinking of some of the recent debates that have happened with regard to routes out of empire and looking back at what some people have called the federal moment, or the ways in which imperial federalism might have been possible. And you mentioned your colleague Adam Getachew's wonderful book, and I think she makes a series of arguments for rethinking the international system in such a way that makes it difficult to then imagine forms of imperial federation as having been possible at that moment, given the kind of centrality of race to those structures. So I'm just wondering whether you see what you're doing as playing a part in or having relevance to those debates, and also potentially to debates about where post-colonialism is at right now, and the whole idea of post-colonial disillusionment, or the kind of David Scott thesis about how to think about history from a post-colonial perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm mostly a kind of interested consumer of that literature. I think, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, her book shows, on the one hand, the insight that all of her people have is that simple diffusion of nation statehood is not in any sense a solution to the problem. Federation is one political route that some attempt, and I think, you know, this scholarship, Fred Cooper and others are, you know, have been pursuing this ways in which various forms of anti-colonial action still used imperial imaginaries, or, you know, federations within the empire. As she shows in her book, you know, it doesn't succeed, and it may just be that the structure of the global order is so stacked against those that nothing that they can do really works. I mean, the NIEO is another moment where it looks like, you know, that and here's another place where Alexandrovich, who's, you know, I'm a fan of, along with other kind of post-colonial lawyers, is really excited about the UN General Assembly as a forum. Like, we have numbers, you know, they may have the Security Council, but with the power of numbers, surely we can do things, you know, solidarity among the quote-unquote new states. We can accomplish things in the General Assembly. That project also sort of goes nowhere, or fails to, you know, to pull off the transformations that it's attempting. Just to cite one other line of argument that that is kind of interesting and relevant in this perspective is the PhD dissertation of a student in my department, Tejas Parashar, who's working on kind of forms of anti-imperial argument in early 20th century India that precisely are not tethered to the nation state. And Ambedkar is one of his figures who's worried about, you know, Ambedkar sees transformed representation within the empire for disadvantage, you know, for lower castes, et cetera, in India, as potentially a route of economic empowerment and emancipation. After the moment at which it's clear that India is going to become a state, he has other ways of thinking about it, but his vision of emancipation for the most vulnerable is never tethered to nation-state sovereignty. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting new work that's looking for moments of possibility outside the nation-state sovereignty vision, which, as you say, David Scott and others have. We're in a sort of moment of disillusionment when it seems like that project failed in so many ways. So yeah, again, I'm not sure that I, at the moment, have anything original to contribute to that conversation, but I think it's a really important one that could go in many different directions. Yeah,
we're a minute and a half. Yeah. So first of all, just to say, actually, I think it is worth mentioning that there's a roundtable on Jennifer's book on Thursday. Check out the details online. But you're all invited to a reception, which will appear outside presently. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Jennifer for an incredibly stimulating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.